I'm excited to share with you some opportunities to profit from inflation. Yes, we're facing outrageous inflation today, and there are 3 key factors that if you understand, you can start profiting from inflation. I'm Justin Hitt with Sustainable Wealth Secrets. So I've mentioned it before, this commission that I put together. I originally started writing this in 2019 or so because clients were noticing inflation coming in. They were noticing how expensive things were getting, and they were believing that it didn't take much for something bad to happen and really cost them a lot of money. Now, if you're not familiar what inflation is, which I wouldn't understand why you would not be, but inflation is basically where your buying power is reduced. So the currency has devalued and what you can buy for the same dollar is much less, and therefore the prices seem inflated. Now, prices aren't really inflated. It's a combination of things, and it's not something new. So I'm going to share these 3 things with you that help you profit from inflation. And number 1 thing is to understand that inflation is nothing new. I know we blame inflation on Biden. We blame inflation on Trump. Blame inflation on Obama. By the way, did you know during the Obama administration, food prices went up 50%? Now, was that Obama's fault? Not necessarily. Bush, you go all the way back. Inflation happens all the time. It is not a current state issue. It's because we have a fiat currency. So that's a currency that's based on basically how much money the central bank prints. And so inflation tends to be a function of central banks all over the world. The United States is not unique. But knowing this helps you stop blaming certain politicians. Now, the policy is a different story. Giving away $2 trillion, doesn't matter what president does it, that's a problem. Allowing the debt to increase, that's a problem. But here's my point. We know inflation is something that's always happening. The typical employee that goes to work for a company, within 5 years, even though they're earning a higher dollar amount, they have half the buying power. Understand this. This is very important. Take out your offer letter from when you started working at whatever company you're working for. Look at how much you made 5 years ago. And then go to an inflation calculator and calculate that current value of that money today, and you'll see that that is a dollar amount larger than what you are being paid today. So it means basically you're getting paid less today for often more work. This is important to understand. This is the number 1 factor to help you profit from inflation, is understanding that inflation is cyclical. We have inflation and deflation. We have it historically. We have it today. We have it even if we don't know anything. In fact, the Federal Reserve says it's healthy to have a 2% inflation. Well, it's actually not healthy to have a 2% inflation if you're only getting 1% raises every year, because basically your cost of living is increasing 2%, but you're only getting paid 1%. And so your current pay buys less stuff. But again, if we understand the historical prospect, we can look at 1970s when there were fuel shortages and the government couldn't pay its debt and citizens couldn't pay their debt. Their earnings were not producing enough. And ultimately, we had problems. But we survived. We had the 80s after that. We had the 90s. We had dot-com boom, all that stuff. Understanding that, number 1, inflation is always happening in some shape or form. It's a historical concept. It happened during the Revolutionary War. That's going to help you move forward. Number 2 is understanding that your income must outpace inflation, not just your gross income. Because again, you can have a bigger dollar amount pay. Maybe 5 years ago you're making $120,000 a year, and now you're making $125,000 a year. It seems like more money, but over the 5 years, inflation is reduced your buying power. But your income, not your savings, your income must increase faster than inflation. Otherwise, you're going to be stuck behind the buying power. So let's say you have a low income and huge savings. You make $150,000 a year. You got $1 million in savings. It's entirely possible for that $1 million in savings, if it has no income value to you, to actually cut in half in its buying power. See, that's the big problem for retirees. The government can make decisions today that impacts retirees 10 years down the line and makes their $15,000 a month in retirement income or retirement, withdrawal not actually be worth anything. So again, we have to have that income increasing. If inflation's 2%, your income needs to inflate 4%. I was working contracts, so government contract. I was working in the financial side on the IT work, and we had to build in our numbers and our costs. We'd actually build in an 8% in the contract, an 8% cost of living allowance for every person on the contract. Now, does that mean the employee got 8% raise every year? Of course not. But it was built into the contract because we knew that if we had to hire a new employee, we'd have to pay market wages for the employee. And if there's inflation in the marketplace, that employee is going to demand more because they need to make more money than their expenses. So this is very important. Your income has to beat inflation, and your expenses are built into that. So you have to know what these numbers are. That does mean, by the way, when you're looking at your cash reserves, you want to build that in. You're looking at your retirement, you want to build that in. It is possible to get to a point where you can't earn the dollar amount you need to earn to cover these numbers. And so you're going to make adjustments. And that gives us tip number 3. I call it intentional thrift. And a lot of people call me a cheap bastard. But tip number 3 to profit from inflation is to have that free net cash flow so that you can invest in assets that cash flow. I know. This is kind of weird. I'm telling you to be thrifty or conservative with your money because the realization is that costs are always increasing. So we got to put away some money in investments, put away some money buying assets. And then those assets have to grow faster than inflation so that when you're in your future state, the future value of the money, you're going to keep up with the costs. Now, for me, intentional thrift includes calculating the present value of money and the future value of money and making sure that I have a baseline for my earnings. Like I know in the stock market, I can earn 4 to 5% low risk. I use this as a basis to know where I can go above and beyond. I know my discretionary expenses. I know my required expenses. I know how much debt service is. Now, when I work with clients, again, I'm not a financial advisor. I work on strategy and I work on the analysis of the situation. If you've got one income stream and you got 0 passive income streams, then it's going to be harder to increase that income beyond inflation, especially today when inflation is 7 and 8% according to the government. But we know actual inflation, like in the Obama administration, food prices going up 50%. That's 50% inflation in an area of food. Food is a required and necessary expense. And so you need to make sure you can budget for that. Having a higher income works, but also we have time constraints. So you need to make sure you have that passive income. The passive income could come from investments. It could come from owning rental property that you can lease out and of course, increase the rents as the marketplace expenses get higher. It could be from oil and gas rights. It could be from a lot of different things that inflation adjusts. But again, if you can reduce your day-to-day living expenses, I'm not saying you got to live like a homeless person. I'm just saying if you can reduce your day-to-day living expenses, you'll increase the free net cash flow that gives you money to invest. The investments that are made are beating inflation. You can start building up that passive income so that while you're in a marketplace which may not increase wages as quickly as inflation is coming, you may enjoy your job and may not want to job hop. You may be running a business that's having a challenge because they shut down small businesses during COVID. By having a lower, deliberate, modest lifestyle, you're going to have the free net cash flow to stock up, and eventually you'll get to a point, and it's not a slow thing, by the way, because if the economy is deflating and costs are going down, new technology comes out and costs go down, you're still beating inflation. You're making 4, 5, 10% on your money. Through various means, you start having a more diverse portfolio and approach that helps you stay ahead of inflation. Now, of course, I wrote a report on this that's 40-some pages, and it goes into the specifics about profiting from inflation. The 3 points that I delivered here are important, and they're foundational for you to start getting results right now. Listen to this several times. If you have questions, do contact me. But it's critically important to preserve your wealth beyond the next cycle of inflation or hyperinflation, and to discover the mistakes to avoid the strategies that don't work in hyperinflation. Because again, if your income is beating inflation and inflation's getting worse because the government's increasing debt, they're doing stimulus programs, the Federal Reserve increases interest rates, there may be a need for you to jump and get ahead of hyperinflation, or at least be able to hold your wealth straight so that you can provide for your daily means. Now, if your daily means are lower than average for your income level and you've got this wide free net cash flow, you've got a buffer so you can stay ahead of things. But ultimately, this isn't the responsibility of the government. This isn't something they're going to teach you in school. This isn't something that's magically going to come to you. To profit from inflation, it starts right now where you're at. It's not too late, by the way. Just because you didn't know this stuff before doesn't mean you can't start implementing it right now. And I would do a summary, but I'm at time. But listen to this program again. 3 simple steps will get you started. And if you have specific questions about addressing inflation, just because you got $20 million in the bank doesn't mean inflation isn't going to hurt you. Just because you've got a business of your own and a single income stream that you have a lot of control over doesn't mean inflation is not going to hurt you. But again, you can hedge against inflation, not necessarily through gold, not necessarily through precious metals, but through a variety of means, and you can essentially profit from inflation. And some of the tips that I have in here are actually unusual tips, but this report I put together from client interviews. I put together from different types of monetary research. I put together from stories about other people who did not gain success in hyperinflation environments, or they had success in hyperinflation. Anyway, I'm Justin Hitt from Sustainable Wealth Secrets. If you've got questions about profiting from inflation, if you've got questions about preserving your wealth despite unusual or awkward economic situations, then visit me at www.sustainablewealthsecrets.com. sustainablewealthsecrets.com, all one word. Or you can put a comment below if you're listening to this on one of the platforms that allows it. But it's best to just go visit the website, go to the contact page, send me a letter, send me a fax. I'm delighted to hear from you. The results that you can get implementing these 3 steps can mean staying ahead of inflation, not necessarily profiting from it. But again, I've got this report. If you've got questions, I'll let you know how you can get a copy of this report. I finished it up for clients. I got a lot of notes for a second revision because clients came back with some questions and concerns. We've addressed those. I'd love to address this for you. Again, thanks for listening. I'm Justin Hitt with Sustainable Wealth Secrets, where we help you transform income into wealth and preserve that wealth no matter what the economic state of the world is. Thanks for listening.